Hey, Chaz, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but there's a terrible echo for some reason. It might be, I think I have it up twice. Hold on. That was my fault. Okay, try that again.
How are you doing?
Not bad. How are you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I've accidentally had two instances running as well, and it did cause an echo.
Yeah. So basically, as the title of the debate states, the position I'm taking tonight is that atheism is, by and large, intellectually dishonest. So, if you don't mind, I don't mind getting right into it. If you want to start with pleasantries, we can take a minute to sort of talk before we get into the debate, but I don't mind jumping right in.
Is this a pass the mic debate? I guess not, right? We just back and forth.
I didn't set it up as a formally timed thing. We can sort of agree to gentleman's rules on that, so that we can have an indicator of when we're done speaking, so we can let the other take over. But I don't like the 3-minute time frame.
I don't either. Too many times I rush.
Mm-hmm.
I like a little bit of niceties. I'm Chaz.
Nice to meet you, Chaz. I'm Davey.
And I'm currently in South Korea, so for me it is 4:46 p.m. Sunday.
Wow, nice.
And former believer, been an atheist for approximately 30 years.
Okay.
And really, for the purposes of this debate, that's probably the only information that you need. So I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. So my name is Davey. I'm a Roman Catholic, traditional Roman Catholic, and I have been for going on about 9 years now. I was actually a convert from what I would best describe as agnostic theism. So I was agnostic, but leaning more towards the side that God most likely exists, or some form of deity most likely exists. And from that, I converted to Catholicism. Currently, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, so it's 12:47 a.m. I do have Mass in the morning, but I go to kind of a later one, so it'll be all right.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'll pass it back to you.
Just out of curiosity, you say that you're forget the word you use, not a conventional Catholic, but a traditional Catholic. Now, I actually respect a great deal what I would refer to as the scholasticism of Catholicism. But I come from a part of Idaho in which, when I grew up, there was sort of a Roman Catholic splinter group. I don't know what their formal name was, but they were known as the Blue Army locally because all of the women wore clothes. Even the teenage boys, I think the word were tonsured. They didn't sit during services. Everything was in Latin. And they definitely wouldn't consider Pope Francis to be their pope. So I'm not entirely sure what you mean by traditional Catholic. What do you mean by that?
Okay. So I'm not sure about being tonsured. I'm not sure about the Blue Army or anything like that. But as far as a Catholic splinter group, which does not consider the current pope to be validly pope, that sounds to me like sedevacantism, which is Latin for the seat is vacant. They believe that the seat of Peter is vacant. So when I say I'm a traditional Catholic, I don't mean that. No, I believe that our current pope is he's validly pope. I may not agree with some of the things that he privately says, but I'm not really going to get into the canon law as for what constitutes something the pope is saying that Catholics have to believe, and what constitutes something he's saying is just kind of personal revelation or personal opinion, rather.
Right.
But no, I do believe that the current pope is our pope. But when I say that I'm a traditional Catholic, I mean I attend a traditional Latin Mass. I adhere more to the traditional values before there was this kind of influx of modernism that you see in like the 60s with the sexual revolution and with Vatican II and everything like that. I don't reject Vatican II on its face. I'm actually currently sort of on the cusp of doing more research into Vatican II, because a lot of people do reject Vatican II and consider themselves still Catholic, but I mean, there's kind of a debate there as to whether you can do that. So I do accept Vatican II, but I follow some of the more pre-Vatican II.
Okay, the only reason I ask is, on Facebook, I'm a member of a group that is called, like, the Militant Catholic, and they refer to themselves sometimes as traditional Catholics, and they're, they don't accept that Francis is the Pope. They're traditional in a hardcore.
They're radically traditional.
Radically traditional, right. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure. Not that it would necessarily make any difference to this debate, but it might, so.
Right.
Okay,
yeah.
So this is your proposition, so you really should start it. Go first.
Absolutely. So, okay, as I said, atheism is, by and large, intellectually dishonest. And what I mean by that, it's kind of important to define our terms here. So there are a few different types of atheism, as I'm sure you're well aware, and I've seen some of your previous debates. I've gathered that you're more of an agnostic atheist. So I'll go down the line starting with the most intellectually dishonest and coming down to a point where I can consider you to be intellectually honest. So Gnostic atheism, that is knowing atheism, is generally accepted to mean the positive claim that God does not exist. A Gnostic atheist claims with, I won't say certitude, but near certitude at the very least, like Richard Dawkins claims in The God Delusion, it is almost certain that God does not exist. This kind of thing is idiotic outright. In every single instance of Gnostic atheism, the belief disqualifies itself by the very same epistemic criteria that they use to come to that conclusion. I do not believe that absence of evidence is the same as evidence of absence, and I don't even think that you can adequately say there is an absence of evidence for God. I'll get into some of the arguments for that later on, or at least some sort of deity. So that's Gnostic atheism, and I think outright it disqualifies itself because it claims to know too much from a position that is supposedly withholding belief because they can't really be satisfactorily convinced. So taking that a step down the ladder, you have agnostic atheism, which I'll invite you in a moment to correct me on this definition, since I know this is the position that you hold. So if you so choose, you can correct me on this. But generally, it's the withdrawal from the belief in any positive claim of God on the grounds that you haven't been satisfactorily convinced by it. An agnostic atheist typically believes that the existence of God isn't necessary to explain the known phenomena in the universe, and therefore a naturalistic worldview it's more pragmatic, it's simpler, it's more self-evident if anything can be considered to be. And while you don't take a hardline position on it, an agnostic atheist would generally consider the naturalistic position, that is, the natural universe is probably all that exists, or all that is at least relevant to our existence. If anything exists outside, it probably doesn't matter anyway, and that this is the more probable and more pragmatic position. Now, I hold that even agnostic atheism, which weighs more probability towards the atheistic side, can be refuted by a number of arguments for natural theology, which build a cumulative case indicating theism to be far more likely just based on what we can observe. So before I actually go into getting into what I think would be intellectually honest, I'll pass the mic back to you, and I'll give you a chance to possibly clear up any misrepresentations I may have made in my definition of agnostic atheism.
Your definition of agnostic atheism is great. It's the one that most people who had taken the time to learn that it was would discover that it was. I hear other less flattering definitions. We're fence sitters, people who just can't make up their mind. Well, it's not that. And any minor quibbles that I might have with the definition aren't even important. You've nailed it pretty much. Okay. You mentioned Gnostic atheism. When I became an atheist, it was pre-New Atheism. I am not a fan in any remote way of New Atheism. It makes a lot of claims that it shouldn't be making. I'm, for lack of a better word, I'm an old atheist, and that's true perhaps chronologically, but it's certainly true for the belief system. Nowadays, people will talk about, like you did, Gnostic atheism. When I became an atheist, that was referred to as positive atheism or strong atheism, different things. And I need to let you know, just for definitional purposes, that I don't buy that definition entirely. For me, belief and knowledge are on a continuum. Unless we introduce, sensus divinitatis, or personal revelation into it, I don't believe that those things exist, but that changes the equation a little bit if they did. I think that knowledge is belief. It's just, and when I say that I know something, what I usually mean is that I'm very certain of it, but it doesn't mean that I'm not wrong. So for me, my agnosticism is just acknowledging that while I don't believe that God exists, I haven't been convinced by reason or evidence that he, she, it, they certainly might. And I don't care either way. And I don't mean that it wouldn't be important to me if I believe that God exists. It certainly would, but I don't favor one conclusion over the other. My lifestyle wouldn't change. Nothing in my life would change other than I would believe that there was a God. And let me add, I'm not conflating here Christianity and theism. To me, those are different subjects. So I could believe in God without believing that Jesus was, my savior. So back to you.
Okay. Yeah, I find your view on knowledge and belief to be particularly interesting. That it's sort of a personal certainty, but not like the positive ontological statement that excludes the possibility of you being wrong. I think that's a good definition of justified belief. I think that's a very good.
I'm sorry. I think that there are things that are so probably, well, okay, put it this way, a square is a square and not a circle.
Right, because definition of terms. See, I am a firm believer in definition of terms, and I think one of the worst kinds of fallacies is one that would reject an argument's conclusion because it misunderstood the terms. Right. And I think that a lot of the most prominent atheistic arguments which claim that arguments for God's existence fail on, or the atheistic arguments actually fail to demonstrate that the theistic arguments fail, based on the fact that they simply misunderstand the terms. So in a very complex way, they're essentially straw man arguments. But back to what I was saying. Thank you. Back to what I was saying about where I would draw the line between intellectually dishonest atheism and a more intellectually honest view. So we're going to go back down the ladder, and we're going to come to truly neutral agnosticism, which states that it is not more likely one way or the other. You simply have no opinion on it whatsoever. It could be just as likely that there is a God, and it could be just as unlikely, just as likely that there is no God, and that you don't hold to one position as either more probable or more favorable from a behavioral standpoint, like, you don't even claim that the naturalistic position is more pragmatic. You simply have no opinion on it whatsoever. This is neutral atheism. Obviously, or agnosticism. When I say you, I'm not talking about you. I mean the collective you. I should say someone who holds this belief has absolutely no opinion on it whatsoever. And generally, that can be considered pretty close to agnostic atheism. But I think that the difference here is that someone in this position would plainly assert that it makes no difference whatsoever. That the truth of the matter, leaning to one direction or the other, would not affect anything in their life. And this is close to what you said. You said that nothing in your lifestyle would change. I actually kind of disagree with that, because the implication of the existence of a deity actually has profound effects on someone's life. Now, not the existence of any deity, but the existence of a particular deity. And this is kind of another thing that distinguishes agnosticism, neutral agnosticism, from agnostic atheism, is that I would say a neutral agnostic thinks that any of the religions could be just as true as the other. They don't even make eliminating claims like, okay, well, that one's obviously not true, that one's obviously dumb. They're just completely neutral about it, and that it doesn't matter whatsoever. And I think this position is intellectually dishonest, because from a position like that, you should really be trying to find out which one is true, if any are true, because there are different moral implications for the different religions. And if, one is true over the other, then that has serious implications for how you should be conducting your life. Now, I am not a fan of Pascal's wager. I think that's kind of a parlor trick argument. And I don't really advocate that at all. Because the way Homer Simpson put it, like, what if we have the wrong God? And every time we go to church, we're just pissing him off more and more. But the very nature of the question, does God exist? And if so, which one? Implies real consequences for a person's life, depending on the answer. So I think that a flat-out neutral agnostic is also being very intellectually dishonest, because they're denying the fact that it is pertinent to find out which, if any, are true. Back to you.
I would consider myself a neutral agnostic, but I'm going to define what that would mean for me. What I said before that I didn't have a vested interest in the answer. I mean that in the sense that I would be thrilled if I believed there was a God. I might be happier if I believed that there was. Matter of fact, I almost certainly would be.
Studies show.
And so my preference would be to believe that there was, but belief is not a switch that I have in the back of my head that I toggle between belief and non-belief. And to be honest, if it was, I might toggle it to the belief side. It would be logical to do so, as it would increase my happiness and would cost me nothing. And sorry for the echoes of, Pascal's wager there. But because I don't like Pascal's wager for precisely the reason that belief is something, that arises. Not for everybody, I don't think. I do have friends who sort of have willfully believed one thing versus the other, have convinced themselves. And I'm not actually talking about anything theological here.
Mm-hmm.
It was, I have a friend who, for a long time, was fairly heavily into a master-slave relationship.
Oh boy.
And it's not that he believed, he came to realize later that that's the way that it should be. He sincerely believed it because it was convenient for him to fulfill his own desires. So I'm a non-believer who would prefer to be a believer, and I'm not able and unwilling to adopt a position that I'm not persuaded by either evidence or logic. I require both, actually. And let me go so far as to say there's lots of evidence for the existence of God, but none of it, for me, is of a sufficient quality or quantitatively or qualitatively to constitute proof. And so, that's why I say that I'm an agnostic, because if I just said, okay, well, the evidence is good enough, to me, that would be intellectually dishonest. I want to believe something because I actually believe that it has, not a 51% chance of being true versus, 49% chance of being true, but because it's more likely true than not. So back to you.
Sorry, I'm taking notes here on the things that you're saying.
No problem.
Okay, so before I move on a little further, I want to address a couple of things that you said. Okay, so you said the belief is not like a switch in your head that you can flip and choose to believe something. Now, I don't entirely agree with that. I believe that when given an array of options that are all equally valid and that have different quantities of evidence weighing in favor of them, that evidence might not be past a certain threshold that is, arbitrarily set in your head to where you're going to say, okay, well, that's the line. That proves it to me. But when you are presented with three options that simply by logical inference, one and only one is true, it's not that 0 of them are true. It's not that 2 of them are true. It's not that all 3 are true. One, no more, no less, of these options is true. When you're presented with a platter like that, and there is a quantity of evidence for each of those cases, I believe that you can choose which one to believe. And I believe that it is intellectually dishonest to completely withdraw judgment on something that at least one of these options is true, and I can look at which one is most likely. So I believe that you can flip a switch in your head to believe. And as you said, some people have, flipped switches to believe things that are completely not true, or that, are simply a matter of convenience. So I think that, honestly, it seems the way some people just let logic bounce off of them, and I'm sure you know the type of people I'm talking about, Gnostic atheists for one, that belief is more about choice to convict yourself to a certain position than it is about simply intellectually reacting to, arguments that come at you like, water filling up a cup. When the cup is full, okay, now I'm satisfactorily convinced. It is more of a choice than a natural reaction. Next, I wanted to address what you said, that there is, this ties in with that there is not enough evidence to constitute proof. Now, I don't want to get into all of the natural theology arguments here, but to leave you with a few, I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the talks that Dr. William Lane Craig has given, but the Kalam cosmological argument, when coupled with the mathematical proof, it is a proof, it is not a theory, of the Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which has been actually mathematically demonstrated to be solid, that the physical universe cannot escape the need for an absolute beginning, a finite time ago in the past. Well, I think when you couple that mathematical and scientific evidence with the philosophically sound, you can't speak tonight, the philosophically sound proposition of the Kalam cosmological argument, I think that alone even setting the argument from morality, the argument from innate intelligibility of the universe, and a myriad of other things, I think that there is quite enough evidence to constitute proof, at least in deism. Maybe not in any particular, religion. Maybe not in Christianity in particular. I'm happy to get into that later with the historical veracity of the New Testament stories and the resurrection story in particular, but at least to believe in monotheism, which should really get the noggin jogging to think which of the monotheistic religions, or which as of yet undiscovered monotheistic religion, would be true. I think there is enough proof to demonstrate that, precisely because of what you said next, it is more likely true than its alternative. Monotheism is more likely true than polytheism, which literally doesn't make any sense from a philosophical standpoint. And even the major polytheistic religions resort to monotheism at their face. The Greek religion starts with chaos as the primordial matter that everything else comes out of. So even that boils down to a monotheistic view, because it's the only thing that philosophically stands up. And atheism, which is your only other option, agnosticism states that you don't know between them. But atheism states there is no God. Polytheism states there are multiple gods. And monotheism states there is one. Monotheism is more likely true than either of those alternatives. So I think it categorically justifies belief in it. So based on that, and this is kind of the crux of my argument, I think the only intellectually honest position, I'm going to take a step back because I forgot to address one thing that you said. You were actually more claiming the mantle of a flat-out agnostic, neutral agnostic, than the agnostic atheist, which leans more towards the naturalistic view as pragmatic and more probable, at least based on the principle of Pascal's wager. So I'm not even going to assert here that your personal worldview is intellectually dishonest beyond what I've said about it being pertinent to find out which, if any, is true, if that is your position. But I'm not going to put you in the category of agnostic atheist anymore. So if anything is intellectually dishonest on your part, it's to say that you are an agnostic atheist after the definition that I just gave you would say that you're a flat-out agnostic. But I'm digressing a little bit. I'm going to wrap up here so I'm not taking too much more of the time. I'll say that the only intellectually honest position that is not guilty of any sort of intellectual dishonesty is an optimistic sort of agnosticism, which holds that while you're unsure, there is most likely a God, theism is more likely true than not, and that it is pertinent for you to resolve yourself to find out whether or not that is true, and if so, which. So the only intellectually honest position that I see of any religiously unaffiliated position is the actively religiously searching position. Now, I'm not an advocate of new religions popping up because being a Catholic, I actually do believe we've found the right one. That's pure personal conjecture. I'm not trying to defend that position in this debate. But even somebody who goes out and starts their own religion because they think they've found out the truth, I think that so long as they're basing that on something, something logical, something at least manifestly evident to them, and they're not just making it up like the Book of Mormon came out of nowhere, then even that is more intellectually honest than completely withholding judgment and just saying, I have no dog in this fight. Simply by the nature of the question, does God exist, and if so, which one? Every single person has a dog in that fight. And I don't consider the position of optimistic, searching agnosticism to be atheistic at all. Therefore, the premise of my position stands. Back to you.
I think probably, at the conclusion of this debate, that we could schedule a second one, because this is a very big subject. And there's lots of things that you've brought up and that I've brought up that even with the 15 minutes remaining, we don't have enough time to adequately cover. In a lot of ways, I agree with you, but in important ways for me personally, I disagree. Now, let me explain that I don't consider it unlikely at all that deities exist. I mean, and I'll give you my logic here. Many scientists, atheists and believers alike, believe in the possibility of sentient, sapient extraterrestrials, right? Well, if I'm willing to allow intellectually that there might be beings, entities, whatever you want to call them, that exist elsewhere in the universe, that compared to me, my sentience, sapience, etc., is ant-like, then why not? To me, those things go together. So specifically, you might as well call me a deist following that description. But in the West and today, that term doesn't explain very much to anybody in and of itself. It used to be, when
if I may interject, though, it's a good starting point. I admire someone who can bring themselves to say, I at least believe in deism, and we can go from there. I admire that more than I can tell you.
I'm not... Okay, I'll deny myself as a deist. I was, for many years, a Pentecostal. I spoke in tongues, the whole 9 yards. And for a multitude of reasons that are sort of beyond the purview of this discussion, I stopped believing. And for me, atheism, in what it minimally entails, is not saying that God doesn't exist. It's saying that I don't believe that God exists. I would never make the positive claim. It claims too much. And a little bit of history here. When I became an atheist, most people who were, and this was because of Usenet, partially, if you know what Usenet was, it was a college forum, text only, and it was the Bertrand Russell definition that was commonly used. And Bertrand Russell, it was explaining why he was an agnostic. And he divided belief down into three categories. He said that basically you could be a theist, who was someone who claimed to know that God existed. Or you could be an atheist, who was someone who claimed to know that God did not exist. Or you could be an agnostic, which was someone who claimed that it was impossible to know either way. When I became an agnostic, that seemed the more reasonable position. I thought that it was asinine to claim, it is asinine to claim that you know that God doesn't exist. But in the balance, I had to conclude that it was also asinine to claim that you knew that God did exist. Now, I'm not excluding personal revelation. I understand that, perhaps God, and if you can invoke the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost here, right, if you want, reveals himself. And then, there's also sensus divinitatis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is the belief that everybody really knows that there is a God. I mean, possibly even at a hardwired level. And that might be true. I can't dispute it. It's not a disputable thing. So specifically,
can I ask a question there? Right. Sure. I mean, if you don't mind me interjecting.
Oh no, that's fine.
Okay. I think that sensus, I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right, but it's Latin for the sense of the divine. The sense of the divine. So let's go with that. Sure. I think that some things can be categorically proven, some statements. And the statement that everyone, follow me on this, it's a little technical, everyone innately knows the existence of God can be disproven by just one. So do you innately feel yourself that the existence of God is likely? And do you feel that little scraping in your heart that's like, I mean, is that God there? Is he kind of talking to me in some little innate way? Because if you personally don't feel that at all, if you're honest about answering that, then that actually might say something about sensus dignatum.
Well, I don't feel that, and I understand where you're coming from entirely, but that doesn't mean that an accumulation of enculturation and acculturation towards a certain belief hasn't
dampened it.
Right.
Right.
So I don't know. It might be there, but it's nothing that I believe in personally. So to be specific, I find the possibility of deity, and I know that some Christians object to be referring to God as a deity, but so I can use that word to mean the omniscient, omnipotent super being who created and controls the universe.
That's the traditional definition. That's the one I had to.
Yeah, so that's the one that I'm going to use here. I'm not opposed to that belief. To me, it's as likely as any naturalistic explanation, but it's not. I don't find it more likely than any naturalistic explanation.
What if I could prove to you it was necessary?
That would be something that would probably require and I'm game a separate discussion, because this is more discussion than debate. Mm-hmm. But in particular, I find belief in you can call it the Judeo-Christian or the Abrahamic.
I prefer to drop the Judeo part of that, but okay.
Okay, so let's just say the Abrahamic religions. I hesitate to go with that term because strictly speaking, the God of Islam is not the God of Christianity.
I agree with that statement. Thank you for that.
But the God.
I think you have three. You have the modern Judaic deity. You have the Christian deity, which is the traditional Hebrew deity. It's very separate from modern Judaic deity. And then you have the Islamic deity. But I'm sorry, I keep interjecting here. I'll let you have it.
No, that's okay. So let me just say that I find the existence of the God of the Bible and or the Quran extremely unlikely. And it's for lots of complicated reasons, none of them having to do with the likelihood of the resurrection, etc. Just the narrative structure, and this is too complicated to go into in this session, but the narrative structure, it feels fictional to me. I'm a writer, right? And the whole story feels like, and when I use the word story, I'm not assigning it a truth or a true or false value. The whole story, the whole narrative feels like something that somebody sat down and constructed rather than something that is narratively true. And no offense at all, but a lot of that, I'm going to attribute or place a lot of the blame for that perception on some of the things that I feel that Roman Catholicism introduced to the Christian narrative. But, far beyond that, the whole idea, the concept of sin that, it depends how much of a literalist you are. I have no idea how much of a literalist you are. I don't know.
Not very much of one.
Not very much of one. You've read any of Grimm's fairy tales or Aesop's fables or Hans Christian Andersen stories, and Christianity in particular as a paradigm feels like fiction to me. And that's a huge subject with, and when I said Roman Catholicism, well, the infallibility of the Pope wasn't introduced for a long time as doctrine.
Only about 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. The Marian apparitions to me are ridiculous. I know I've had devout Catholics explain to me that they don't worship Mary, and I believe them on an intellectual level. But I've also seen the rapture in their faces, the almost orgasm that they have.
Have you seen the rapture in a child's face when they look at their mother?
Yes, I have.
It's not worship, but it's very appropriate to apply to Mary.
There's just so many things. I won't go into the other things, but I listened to a Catholic priest on the radio, on the radio, literally cry because somebody had stepped on a wafer because it was the body of his God. And he cried, well, how would you feel if, well, at some level, maybe that's true, but it's also just a cracker. So there's whole parts doctrinally that repel me. I'm not picking on Roman Catholicism here, because the whole idea that the best plan that God could come up with actually required blood atonement.
Mm-hmm. I see your point.
Barbaric.
Mm-hmm. Do you mind if I have the last 2.5 minutes to address some of the things that you said?
Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you covered a lot. I'm just going to touch on them in brief, like little 5-second sound bites, basically. So I don't believe that sufficiently advanced alien life can be accurately considered a god, because it's not omnipotent, which I think is a necessary component of God. You said that atheism and what it minimally entails is a lack of belief on a personal level. And that's what it minimally entails. And I think even that lack of belief can be considered intellectually dishonest, because you get to a point where there's so much that is inferred by basic axioms you take. Even the scientific schools of thought take certain things on axioms, that the universe is innately intelligible, that the universe is consequential and consistent. And Sam Harris likes to propose a science of morality, which implies, and I don't think atheists on the whole reject the idea of morality, and it implies that the universe, at least in some capacity, is morally significant. And I think that those three axioms taken together, which you can't refute if you believe in science at all, or if you believe in morality at all, actually infer the existence of the necessary being that I'm going to be happy to get into the next debate with you, to a degree that lack of belief in that is actually more akin to denialism than simply withholding it. The last thing I want to address is what you spent more of the last couple of minutes talking about, in that it all feels fictional. It all feels like a fictional narrative laid out. And I guess my best argument against that is that since you are talking about the Christian narrative, I'm going to go into the Christian narrative, and assuming the Christian narrative is true, I'm not a presuppositionalist, but assuming it's true, we are created in God's image, meaning that our minds are patterned after God's mind. And so the fictions that we would come up with as humans, which reflect the deeper aspects of human life and reflect a sort of chronology of the struggle of mankind, I don't think it is at all weighing against the Christian viewpoint to say that we would echo those throughout our own fictions. So I simply think that you mix up the cause and effect. I think that your idea of the Christian narrative seeming fictional is true, but it's because fiction echoes the truth of the Christian narrative.